practical certainty. We've come to a very crucial watershed. We've been looking at the fact that science, objective science, it looks at objects, physical objects. It measures them, their length, their weight, their temperature, velocity, and so on. But science itself is not a physical object. Science is outside the range of science, because science is looking outside. Like, if you're living in a lighthouse and you want to read a book, you have to have another light. You can't read by the light of the lighthouse, because that's outside. So science also, if you want to look at science, you have to use a different process than the objective scientific process. So it means that objective science is ignorant about the nature of objective science. And that leads us on to practical certainty. I mentioned Jiva Goswami. Jiva Goswami talked about things that we could be certain of. They're self-evident, they're true by experience means, and at the same time they're so essential, so fundamental, you can't possibly put anything in their place. Well, that's not true of physical entities, because you can always divide up physical entities, or you can replace one physical entity by another physical entity. So the real elements, the real basis of everything, is not going to be physical entities. So what we find is that it's the essential aspects of the scientific process which are the real basis of our reality. They're the real things that we can be certain of. So, for example, starting with science is a science of experience. That tells us that experience is fundamental. Experience is an element. Perception is an element. We perceive things. For example, we see things, but we can't say what sight is. Sight is what we use to see other things, but we can't see sight. We can't describe it, and that means we can't explain it. If I can't say what I'm talking about, I can't explain how it's appeared. If I can't describe what I mean by perception, then there's no way that I'll explain how perception has come from physical causes. And perception is not a physical entity. It doesn't have temperature, it doesn't have velocity, it doesn't have mass. So that's perception is the base, what part of the basis of reality. It's something we can agree on, but at the same time we can't describe it and we can't explain it. It's just there. Then the next thing is mental process. Scientists have to think. They have feelings about what they're thinking about. Like, a lot of scientists have very strong feelings about creationists, for example. They feel very strong, this is not right, and science is right. Strong feelings. And they desire to find a good, consistent explanation. So they have to think, they have to have feelings, they have to have desires. But you can't describe the mind from outside the mind. Whatever kind of description of the mind you have, it's also going to be a mental conception. So you can never get outside the mind to describe it from outside, which means you can't, if you can't describe it, then you can't explain where it's coming from. The mind can't explain the mind. So again, the mind is also not a physical object. It's an essential part of science, and because it's an essential part of science, science can't describe it objectively. Then purposeful activity as well. Now, here we come to a sensitive point. Scientists want to say that there's no such thing as a supernatural or non-naturalistic influence in the world, but they themselves are doing things that material things don't do. A scientist sets up an experiment. Experiments don't set up themselves. So a scientist is engaged in purposeful activity to do things that wouldn't happen by themselves. So purposeful activity is also something that we see. It's true by experience, but you can't. It's so fundamental that you can't put anything in its place. You can't explain how purposeful activity takes place by random actions. You can't explain how something which is obviously deliberate takes place by some random physical interaction. So these, we can call them our conscious faculties. Our faculty for perception, our faculty for mental process, and our faculty for purposeful activity. These are part of the fundamental basis of reality. These are things that we can agree on. They're things that you can never resolve into more elementary entities. They're self-evident, because they're true by experience, and they're self-validating. Because whenever you try to deny them, you only end up confirming them. For example, if you try to deny that perception is a fundamental entity, but you're depending on perception, you're assuming that the person you're talking to can actually perceive what you're saying. And if you do that, you're thinking, suppose we deny that the mind is, we just say that the mind is just the action of the brain and nerve cells and like that. But you still have to, what is a brain? You have to think about the brain. So the activity of the mind is right there. And similarly, if I deny that purposeful activity is something in and of itself, but that itself is an activity. When I talk about activity, that talking is itself a purposeful activity. So I always come back to the fundamental nature of these faculties. So these are real. We can perceive them directly, we can agree on them amongst ourselves, but you can't put anything simpler in their place. So they're an essential part of reality.